Okay, so this is a conversation about the rise of the customer avatar. And in terms of the debate that we have about customers and how best to serve them, I think we often miss the point. We get very obsessed about different channels. You know, the current thing is messaging better than voice, and should we be looking at video and all the rest of it? And I don't think that's really the point. The point being is much more to do with the fact of self-service. And self-service remains extremely difficult to scale. A few people have got into decent numbers, 40, 50%, but I think the majority of people are stuck at very low levels. And of course that's terribly important, because during the pandemic we had a lot of people who were trying to contact humans, trying to talk about their issues and problems, and all of those channels, particularly the voice channel, got flooded. And so we're back to this problem of how to scale. Now, you and I, Alan, have had previous conversations about why that hasn't happened, and there's a couple of problems that there is there. One is complexity of the journey. I think you coined the phrase which said you can't outsource the problem to the customer if it's complex, and I think that's absolutely right. So some people are redesigning, trying to take some of the effort out of those particular journeys. And then the other thing that doesn't work very well is the tech enables it, but there's an art to a conversation. And if we look at IVR, often the failure there has been it's just not user-centric in terms of engaging with it. And the same problems apply to our bots at the same time. So with that all being said, our conversation today is about the next generation and taking it from essentially a 2D representation into a 3D. And this is the rise of the customer avatars. And to help me explore this, I have got three experts here today, which I'd like to introduce, beginning with Attila Vass, VP of Engineering at Speech Graphics and Rapport. Welcome.
Very nice meeting you.
Alan Linter, Director of Innovation at Capita Experience.
Good evening.
And James, Innovation Principal at Capita Experience. Welcome. So together, we're going to have a conversation around of exploring use cases, but also the psychology of why we think avatars take the whole business of engaging via self-service to the next place. So let's get into it. Alan, could we start with trying to sort of set a expectation really for our audience around of what does an avatar look like, what can we expect in today's world, so we've got a frame of reference before we get into another conversation.
Absolutely. There's no real easy description, because I think you can take many forms in terms of avatars. The common ground, obviously, they have a face, which gives that connection with humans in terms of being able to articulate emotion and connect. We've got some examples that I think best bring that to life. I think the first one we're going to look at is actually of a more cartoon character type traditional avatar. People will be familiar with those maybe from what they create for their profiles or their social media profiles, but it gives a good feel for what that type of avatar looks like. James, if you show what's happening.
Good morning, and welcome to our exclusive launch event. We're so excited that you could join us today. Please take your seats, sit back, and relax. We're about to begin.
Okay, so that's your one generation. You've got obviously movement in the face. Yeah, quite a familiar kind of representation. You see it in lots of movies these days, don't you? You know, that kind of level of animation. Okay, that's cool. So that's one version of life.
Yeah, people will be very used to that, as you say. But secondly, things have moved on, and now the ability to create more human, realistic avatars is with us.
Okay.
So there's a good example coming up of what those look like and how they can interact with people.
Right, let's have a look at those.
Hi there, I'm Rowan. How can I help you today?
Hi, Rowan. I'm about to book a flight, and I'm looking for some more information about COVID-19 travel requirements.
Sure, I can help you with that. I bet you're looking forward to traveling again. Can you let me know which country you're traveling to?
I'll be flying to the US.
Great. Which state?
California.
Here are the current COVID-19 travel requirements for visiting California from the UK. 1. Show proof of vaccination. 2. Provide a negative PCR test within 72 hours of your flight. And 3. Fill out an attestation form.
Fantastic. Do I need to know anything else?
CDC officers will be spot checking passengers as they disembark in the US, so have your vaccine information and negative COVID-19 test ready, just in case.
Okay, thanks again.
It was my pleasure. Can I help you with anything else today?
No, I think I have all the information I need.
Okay. Have a great flight, and enjoy your trip. The weather is great in California this time of year.
Okay, that's fantastic and quite different from the first one, actually. So what's going to drive my decision making around of that? Is it if I could have anything, is the price a significant thing, or would I always want to go for the most realistic looking one? What's going to...
I think it depends on your brand, your segment, who you're looking to engage with, what people maybe in your segment are used to interacting with. You might have your own avatar type character that's using advertising that you might want to bring to life in terms of that, or actually seasonality might bring things to it. Why is it not the Easter Bunny or Father Christmas or anybody you're interacting with as a brand? So I think there's many reasons why you might choose different elements along that spectrum, I suppose, in terms of moving from character to digital human realism, as it were. There may be multiple representations of different clients. You may give consumers the opportunity to pick who they want to engage with as a digital human.
Nice idea.
And then in terms of their preference, just as well we build our own avatars to represent ourselves, potentially our social media spaces, you may want to construct or build from a library of people you want to speak to, either in terms of the way they look, the voice they have, how they interact with you. You may be more wanting realism, you may be more fun and gimmicky and gaming and character driven. But there's no right singular answer for any brand, I don't think, or for any organisation. I think we'll see characters across the scale appear and start to be used.
Excellent. So we've got choice.
Absolutely.
And we can have whatever's appropriate for what we're trying to do with that particular segment of customer.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And also, you're suggesting that the end customer can have choice too, potentially, which is another interesting thing.
I think it will definitely come. I think in terms of the ability to create these, and I suppose Attila will talk later, or in terms of that is the possibilities are infinite and the configuration elements are infinite, and therefore, at the moment, maybe the brands will pick, but down the line, consumers being able to pick and choose is absolutely a possibility. I think that people...
Well, our digital voice already, we can choose, can't we?
Absolutely.
Genders and different types, yeah. So that's a
in
natural
our
extension.
cars and our speakers, our speakers, we all do that and have a preference. So maybe there's upgraded in terms of characters that you particularly like. It's interesting in terms of the actual spectrum, the possibilities in that choice.
So have we got any more to look at?
We have, I think there's a really interesting video that actually shows the common theme behind them all, which is actually shows, I think, how the technology works, and how it actually animates what character you pick. The audio is less important actually on this one, but it's actually interesting to see actually how the animation works and bringing those characters to life.
Brilliant. Let's have a look.
So, here's what we're looking to achieve today. Firstly, we'll share our ambition for the future of service, focusing on how this will deliver the very best sales and service customer outcomes. Our proposed operating model builds on our success to date. We will reset and refresh our capabilities and be brave, taking the lead on service delivery as your prime partner. Secondly, we will share our thoughts and learnings on what we believe the critical areas for mutual success will be, such as true partner collaboration, working with and leading a new partner ecosystem, and commercial win-win models. And finally, we will engage to ensure we get the very best results for all stakeholders. A truly connected service to deliver the 3-year business plan results.
So, Attila, when we're building those, I presume that's somewhere along the process of the final outcome. It's a working model.
Yeah, I mean, it's just looking at the face, you can actually see like the eyes darting, the eyebrows moving, the mouth moving, but it's more than that. You can actually see the tongue moving, right?
Yeah.
So I think so what we've done in Rapport is we kind of deconstructed how humans communicate, and that's from starting with me listening to you, as in you model what happens with, with the waves, the sound waves. They enter your brain. It goes into, it has to be recognized what you're talking about. Sentences have to be understood and formed, and it goes to your cognitive part, right? And the cognitive part has to evaluate it, and then form a response. And the response has so many parts. It has the textual response as well as emotional response to it. So it's a very complex, computation, what happens in your brain, right? And then it goes to your verbal and how you express yourself. Then it comes out through your mouth. You have to form those. So there's an insanely complex process for communications, right? So that's exactly what we did at Rapport. At first, as the audio comes in, it goes into a system called ASR, a speech recognition system. Now, as many speech recognition, James can actually attest to that, but as many ASRs, as many results. Some of those you have to pre-configure, like what language is this English? Is this the London accent? What is that, right? So that alone is a very complex a problem. Now, assuming that we actually got the proper textual information back, we then start actually looking at the tone of the voice, and trying to pull out the emotional models, right, and the emotional clues. And then if we can pair those two and hand those over to an AI, which is, I'm just going through the process how it actually happens in your brain, right, and then we hand it over to an AI in this case, which then can form a response to that. And this is what we experienced before. It's like, I would like to fly to the States. I mean, that is a sentence, deconstruct that, trying to actually find the proper answer to that, right? And then once that information comes back, then we can take it to the next level. It's like, all right, what is your avatar? Are you talking about a cartoony one, or is it a real one? And then we have to match the voice properly, because as you know, if the voice is not matched, you go to the uncanny valley very, very, very fast.
The impact feels wrong.
Indeed, and then just like if if you start talking in different voices, people are like, yeah, there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
So please, I'm
Yes.
not even paying attention to what you are saying anymore, right?
Yes.
So it's very important. And the other thing, which in technology is a big deal, is even if after we were able to compute the right movement of the face, which actually, if you think about it, it requires insane amount of science, and it actually, we got to this point by speech graphics through a massive machine learning process. But we generate the right facial expressions, but they have to be synchronized properly. I mean, you probably all heard and you experience when Zoom is out of sync, and the sound comes first and the voice, and then again your attention is somewhere else, right? So there's a lot of small technical things which has to be right in order to deliver the right experience. And so that's what Rapport we've been focusing all along. And that, let's talk about the meta communication aspects of it, right? Because there's a lot of chatbots out there, they provide you with the answers. But I think in order to build that bridge, we have to go to the next level, which is reading your emotional cues, right? And that we have a system in place which can actually extract that information, right? That was number one. Number two, while you are listening, what are you doing while you're listening, right? Now, in different cultures, this actually comes across differently, but for example, right now you're bobbing your head, right? And that tells me that you are paying attention, right?
Yes.
I think it's going to be imperative for our AIs, and actually we do this already in Rapport, the acknowledgement that I am hearing you, keep carrying on, right? So all of these, I think, leading to making these better interactions with our AI.
So if I'm hearing you right, I mean, it reminds me of that statistic that I think a successful communication is only X%, let's say 60%, about the content. The rest of it occurs from all those other meta clues that we get in terms of going, what is that other person really saying to me?
Yes, exactly.
And even with my full attention on you, I've still got to do some work to understand, make it make sense, make sure that if I respond to you, you've received it, and all the rest of the stuff. So actually, it does raise an interesting point that we're discussing here, which is that if we've only got, let's say, text, which is how a lot of bots currently communicate, only look at social platforms to understand how difficult it is for humans to meet each other successfully when it's just text. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah? We spend more time missing the point with each other on
Indeed.
those platforms right now.
Indeed.
So what we're actually propositioning here is providing much more guidance between people as to what the real intent is flowing between two people.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you're absolutely correct. And if you look at it, it goes actually a lot deeper, right? When you only have textual conversation, you're absolutely right. The emotional models or modals also disappear. And when those modals disappear, your perception of your reality also disappears, because you start behaving very differently. Because I know what the etiquettes for normal conversations are in the real world.
Yeah.
But when I'm having that, in an online environment where there's absolutely no emotional information is being exchanged, suddenly the world just breaks down, and people respond to that very differently. Rules disappear. So this is where, for example, as some big companies experienced lately, people became abusive, with their conversations, right? Which is completely the opposite what we would like to actually do with this. So I think for us to focus on establishing that bridge between, the entity and the human is imperative, and we put a lot of effort into that, right?
So really understanding not just the functional content of a conversation, the emotive, the context of it, to be able to understand the meaning that another person's got. So I got that point. You also mentioned machine learning a bit, and I suspect that's something to do with the breakthrough that we're seeing here.
Yes. So speech graphics, for a good 10 years now, they've been focusing on actually training through machine learning of understanding what kind of emotions you're carrying in your voice and how that actually manifests, right? And I could go into details, how that, basically as your muscles move, they have different energy levels, and those energy levels, how on the temporal axis, how those changes, you can actually make certain assumptions, and then through machine learning, we were able to identify most of the patterns that work, and it's actually quite surprising how good the predictions are now. And what's important is all the 10 plus years of technology is now employed inside Rapport when we are analyzing those, and we are immediately utilizing those as well, in our listening behaviors and so on. And that's what actually, I think, separates Rapport from a lot of other.
That's interesting.
aspects.
So with that knowledge, what's the sort of balance between, as a human family, how much are we similar in terms of the machine learning, and how much are we different by function of our gender, ethnicity, age groups? What's the balance on that?
That's up for debate. But
Okay.
Generally speaking, most humans, so most of us go down on an emotional journey, especially during a conversation. So depending on the answers, depending on, for example, if I see that you don't listen, I go through a different emotional journey as well, right? But if you actually, I can see that my voice is being heard, right? That actually gives me a satisfaction, right? So it actually calms down, right? And that is, generally speaking, what we've seen in multiple cultures. That's actually very true. I mean, I myself travel the world, and I think it's safe to say that there are elements which are very common to all cultures, but of course there are plenty of differences as well. But that's the beauty about machine learning, is we can actually add and inclusively add those different type of reactions and emotions as we broaden our databases, right?
So that brings me to an interesting point, Alan, of if we're putting this in the context of sort of modern customer experience, we're trying to personalize at scale. Machine learning is able to hear the nuances between people. Are we sometime in the future therefore able to say we could do that for a segment, we could even do that to an individual, or we could even do that real time, and therefore produce customized interaction that begins to develop, in that sense, almost a rapport between a virtual and a human?
I think absolutely, yeah. I think the ability, almost to get to that segment of one, but there's certainly more similarities than there are differences potentially to start picking out, from a macro level that Attila talked about, down to there are very specific segments, either demographically or just lifestyle-wise. I think too often we pick demographics as a segmentation factor, but in terms of personal motivations and needs, then be able to start to identify those in conversations, to start speaking to those people in a certain way.
Right.
Down the language, even down to the curtness or the expansiveness of the language in the conversation that's used. That actually, some people are looking for very different things. You can hear that in their voice. They essentially want interaction to be quick as possible. Other people traditionally, are maybe want a conversation in terms of that, and that's what digital humans can provide to them at a different cost point maybe to real humans.
Yes.
In terms of that for organisations. So I think that segmentation with the machine learning and the ability to maybe connect individually to your own personal bot, having chosen what they look and feel like, for them to maybe have sometimes starting to evolve some type of personal sentient relationship of having a memory about your style, about past conversations. A relationship could ultimately be established between those people and ended up with your own personal digital human as a concierge into an organisation, either fully resolving issues or conversations, or triaging or brokering conversations back into real humans.
So I think in this new chapter we're looking at, that's a really exciting development path. I mean, that's actually how we're going to deliver this personalisation agenda that everybody's got. I think we should also acknowledge that most people's experience of bots right now is some way off that, and many of us are quite frustrated with it. But what we are saying is, from a technical point of view, and if you do things correctly, you can evolve it to that particular point. I think that's an important thing.
Well, absolutely. I think the power of it is the ability for them to be conversational.
Yep.
And not the frustration with bots, as we've talked before, is about the linear nature of them, and the spirals or circles of doom, and the fact that some conversations are complex.
Yep.
And not everything's an easy A, B, C button choice in terms of what people want to speak about. Particularly as people's digital self-service skills increase, the conversations that they potentially want to have with a human and or digital human are increasingly complex and difficult and more nuanced.
Yes, yes. So if we manage to do that, then we are finally delivering what we want to do, I think, for the live human, which is to focus on the emotive, the complex, the urgent, and all the rest of it. And there's an incredible amount of conversation that can be very easily picked up by this kind of capability that we're looking at. Can I just circle back on one last thing technically, which is all this is quite new. Has there been any significant technical breakthrough that has made this affordable? I mean, if I think, for example, of those avatars, we used to think about those in terms of maybe, the biggest animation companies could afford to do that for the Christmas special. That's happening much more than ever before. But is this now something that organizations can afford, and has something happened that means we don't need massively powerful compute power or anything like that has brought it within an affordability bracket?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I was just going to say that this entire conversation has a lot of different parts. And that the problem is there's going to be always, if a conversation is broken, it's going to be broken because of the weakest link, generally speaking, right?
Yep.
So for example, if the recognition of what you're saying is broken, everything else is broken, right? Because the AI can't respond. If the AI is not smart enough to actually find the right answer, again, the conversation is broken. But after that, if the AI's voice doesn't carry, that particular self-confidence, whatever it needs to be done, again, the conversation is broken.
Yeah.
If the rendering, if the production of the images, are not at a certain level, again, the conversation is broken. So you could say that the weakness is that there's so many interdependent parts, but it's also the strength of it, because it can be independently developed and further, refined. So that's exactly what we see happening. I mean, the big companies right now we are supporting 3 different ASRs. And then what you can do is you choose what's best for you. And guess what? The next thing we're working on is already translations, right? So the translation engines are getting actually better and better. The more we use them, generally speaking, for tech, the more we use something, the better it becomes, right? And the same with rendering. I mean, we've seen some very, very basic rendering, and then now with the new Unreal, with the MetaHumans, rendering is just becoming better. And now is actually, I do believe that current real-time rendering is at least at the level where it was 5 years ago for big companies. So my point is absolutely we are getting to a place where you will talk to an AI and you may not even recognize that you are talking to an AI. And that's because of these particular modular approaches to all the tech. And again, what we've been working with James is in Rapport is you can pick and choose. You can actually choose the right actors, the right parts, and then you can tailor the entire experience, what you're looking for. So yeah,
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Alan, any perspective from your point of view about affordability?
Well, I think it's imminently more affordable than we ever thought, and I think even a couple of years ago when myself and James started looking at this technology, I think it's become more affordable and surprisingly, reassuringly inexpensive actually, given I think the connection it can generate and the reach it can give in terms of conversations. I think it is a layer on top of traditional conversational technology that really turbocharges it and brings it to life. And you know, I certainly am absolutely convinced that the gains that we delivered in connectivity, in terms of containment, in terms of customer satisfaction, you know, will pay back, you know, multiple X times on the slight uplift on what it costs to deploy conversational AI.
Yes. James, tell us a bit about the engagement side. I think it's an interesting one for people to think about. If I reflect on a few stories, just to kick off the conversation, I can remember Nationwide, maybe half a dozen years ago now, were tackling the problem of having experts selling you mortgages sitting in branches doing nothing. And so they thought, let's have a centralised team. How do we then get them from that centralised team back into that branch? And they decided they were going to do it via video. And at the time, that was the time when I think HD video had just turned up and it was a big deal. It's quite expensive, I remember at the time. However, interestingly, it worked extremely well. And sitting behind the results, which were phenomenally powerful in terms of CSAT and people signing on the dotted line and all the rest of it, was the insight that seeing somebody's face talking about what, the most expensive thing you're going to buy in life, a new house, somehow accelerated trust in an important, significant way. And that drove their decisioning. And they did it very well as a result of that. So anything you can tell us about why this generation of avatar is important in terms of increasing the stickiness of that relationship?
Well, I think there are lots of different studies and theory around why we would want to engage or interact with something that looks human-like. But there's a particular study that I come back to, which is from Professor Byron Reeve from Stanford University. And he talks about social intelligence and digital media. And effectively, if you have a character which can display empathy, understanding, a level of emotion and speech over the top of that, it's conveying a level of social intelligence. And it's social intelligence which drives engagement, it determines attention, learning, persistence within human relationships effectively.
Yeah, that makes perfectly good sense. So the proposition here is if you've bought into the notion of, you know, a version of a bot for whatever reasons being better than FAQ, the next stage along the line is to buy something and invest in something which is that much more real.
Yes.
Yeah, and has got additional capability than just delivering an answer. It seems to be more human, therefore we stay more engaged with it.
So consciously, you know, we're aware it's not a real human being, right?
Yes.
Apart from the metahumans that come in where we might get confused.
Yeah.
But subconsciously, we are still having a reaction to what we're seeing on screen and the empathy that we're drawing to the engagement, and it is changing our behaviour and how we react as the conversation unfolds.
Okay, so that's encouraging. Let's look at something else as a potential consideration point. Alan, are avatars weird and wonderful for the majority of average folk outside of the laboratory, or is this something more familiar to people?
I think they're hugely familiar if people stop for a second to think around their daily lives when they interact. And for older people like me, maybe you think about how your children interact in terms of gaming. If anyone's got a small boy like me or girl trying to leverage him off the worlds of Fortnite and Roblox on a daily basis, I'm sure there's plenty of people nodding, listening, thinking this is a daily battle we all have in terms of that stuff. So there's a whole generation of people that have grown up with it. And actually, if you think about going back to those digital characters and being actually people or characters, you know, from a gaming point of view, many of us grew up in the birth of that and are pretty familiar with us. Either, you know, elder people like me have grown up with those avatars and interacting with them and playing with them and making them do things and coding as well. I think, you know, the gaming industry worth 190 billion, 2.8 billion people engaged, pretty much 40% of the population. Tells you that it's not weird and wonderful for a huge chunk of people already, and a generation coming through that will be consumers and spending power if they're not there already. Secondly, I think you talked about the emotional stuff in terms of that connection, but the world of Disney, Pixar, at DreamWorks.
Yep.
To show you, I suppose, how effectively engaged we are with these type of characters. You know, I'll put my hand up to having a good old cry at watching films like Up and, eliciting emotional, they do elicit emotion, and we are connected to them on a daily basis, and we see them. And finally, I think, if you just spend some time watching, if you get time to watch TV in advert breaks, if you're not fast forwarding through character, just look how many digital characters or adverts are the voice of brands in terms of that. Whether it gets over some of the issues in terms of brand perception, because they could be, in terms of ethnicity or how they look and feel, and they become sort of uber appealing. Maybe that's the way they do, but there's a huge amount of them in advertising as well. So they're here, we're touched by them, we've grown up with them, most of us now. Our children are interacting with them for hours on end, potentially, if we're bad parents, in terms of not dragging them off. And therefore, people's familiarity with them is probably, when you stop and think, is much more common, much more here and now. This isn't a thing of the future. Then I think people would, when you reflect, I think a lot of people nod along and think about how often they see them, interact with them, and how much of their daily lives they pop into.
I think that's well said, and I completely buy into it. It's rather similar to say, in call centre terms, why aren't you thinking about a smartphone? Why aren't you thinking about messaging? Because that's what I do as a customer. Why isn't your self-service calibrated to that? Same argument here, really, at the end of the day, saying most of us are very familiar and have lived and breathed it. My son is exactly the same, as is my daughter. I had to produce a Java version of Minecraft with a mod on it yesterday for a 6-year-old. And it took me back trying to figure out how to do all of that stuff. But he was absolutely enchanted when he actually got to that point. And that's going to be the way it goes. So for him, there's nothing strange at all about engaging with anything, from a villager for him up to a strange creature in a netherworld. It's a perfectly normal way of engaging with the world. So I think that's well said. So, okay, so we've covered a number of things here. The text there,
I think the pervasiveness of it is I think is going to be key, right? So, for example, I witnessed the other day is a kid walking up to, I think it was a Pikachu, whatever, right? One of these little things in a store, and goes up to it and says, like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "We played last night in my room." So they take those with them as where they go. And it's just stunning to see the pervasiveness of it all, right? And imagine you get in the car, and then your favorite character greets you, right? So I think that's another. You make this emotional connection, and then from that moment, if you ask something, and through that representation, you will trust it.
Well, we're going to hit that later, but we might as well hit it right now, which is to actually say, at the moment, our experience with these sort of virtual assistants is very transactional and one-off. And I've got to imagine that it's going to become much more persistent in the way that you've just described, And I can't understand why soon school children won't have a persistent avatar from right the way through, And I go to work and I've got this other part of me that comes along with me, and I'll sort of plug it in somehow, and it will become a work aspect for me, etc., etc., etc.
That's brilliant.
And I can't see why that, as part of this generation of exploration, doesn't become more persistent, which is where we give the opportunity to go back to the same avatar, to the same experience, and etc., etc., etc. So, tech works, engagement works, we're familiar with it, let's get on with it, right? Let's get to that part of the conversation, talking about use cases. So I'd like to sort of try to stimulate everyone's imagination around of, testing it out, because it is new, right? We're all agile, hopefully, these days. We all know how to do A/B testing. We're not going to bet the boat on everything to begin with. So what are probably likely little scenarios that we could build off of, which are familiar, but we want to see, does it nudge us, a little bit further out there? So let's take a quite traditional form of self-service to begin with. You're on the website, you're in the support page, you've got those FAQs in front of you, etc., etc. One of the problems that is going on at the moment is the fact that we don't kind of trust that anonymity. We still gravitate towards sitting on a phone and saying, I want to hear the same information but from a real human. My flight didn't go last week, my mate didn't manage to get on the flight, I'm going tomorrow, I don't trust it, my partner's saying find somebody who can tell me, and then we're going to trust that more. So closing that gap is important in terms of trust. Do you think an avatar is more likely to deliver a trusted answer than the traditional two-dimensional bot? Attila, what do you think on that?
So, absolutely. And going to the tech side, right? So for example, whenever you're seeing that the little delayed, another 30 minutes, another 40 minutes, another 50 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So we don't trust it for a reason. I see it delayed with 30 minutes. I woke up to the customer agents. It's like, the plane is not even here.
Yeah.
Did you think it's 30 minutes? Yeah. So you just broke down my trust in anything displayed, right?
Yes.
Meanwhile, you just increased my confidence with that, representative, right? So I do believe that avatars for first of all, because we tend to trust another human a lot better than just some FAQ, which has been produced who knows when, by the way, especially when it's real-time information, right? I do trust a human better because I believe that they have better judgment over what they are saying, right? So in this case, imagine having an AI and it knows that the plane is not in here. It knows that it's going to take about 45 minutes to prep the plane. I understand it's delayed with 30 minutes, but no. So I do believe the technology is already there to provide you with better answers and real time, faster. Now imagine that if it's actually coupled with seeing your frustration, understanding that you're frustrated, maybe even detecting sarcasm, right? All of those, and it can actually respond the proper way, the right way. Either calm you down a little bit or crack a joke, but respond in a more human and more targeted way.
Which is what I'd have got if I'd have gotten on the phone to a human.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And the technology is definitely getting there.
Yes.
And again, it goes back to machine learning, right? So this is indeed what SpeedGraphics has been doing, trying to detect those emotions in spite of you trying to fool the system, but you're still carrying along your original intents. Right?
Okay, so I'm sensing a qualified yes from you. Probably
Absolutely.
Unqualified yes.
Absolutely.
The reason we're interested in that is that means one less live call coming into the queue, not soaking up a human being for reading off of basically a knowledge management system unnecessarily, and that's a win for us. Yes. So that's worth testing to see A/B whether or not we're getting better outcomes.
Absolutely.
Alan, next question, hypothesis-wise. Digital confidence definitely drives the determination of, am I going to self-serve or not? Some people don't feel they can do that. They've got to still talk to a human being. Is an avatar likely to increase the pool of people willing to have a go, do you think? Is it fundamentally offering something that maybe different cohorts are going to feel comfortable with this time around?
Absolutely. I think the fact that it's moving digital interaction to voice is the first thing that actually starts to enable people. It takes away some element of digital literacy in terms of people might have. With language detection, it takes some element of actually some of the language barriers. Somewhere like London, 7% of the population's first language isn't English, and they would prefer to interact with in their own language. Very often maybe voice is that option, so that becomes a barrier to digital self-service. But also putting a face and a human face on the voice channel just makes it more appealing, more engaging, whether some people view it as a gimmick or actually it's that emotional connection that it delivers that people want out of getting the information. It obviously opens up. I think there's lots to talk about demographics. I think that's starting to break down, given how some technology's been around in terms of digital barriers. But certainly, if I think about my family, the use of digital speakers in grandparents and the like is huge. And therefore they're used to speaking to these things. People are used to speaking to digital speakers in cars, over a voice channel, in digital speakers in home. People are used to dealing to that. Putting a face in front of it only makes it more emotionally connected and more accessible. It can only open up more channels. And we've said, for younger people, it's part of their daily life. It's what they do in their virtual worlds, in their space, and where they're playing. And that will just explode further as the metaverse takes hold as a retail space or an entertainment space. So I think, we're going to have the segments that are being used to doing avatars becoming consumers and moving into that space. We'll just increase the interaction with the segments. And we've got older people that probably prefer voice, that this offers, a digital human offers a halfway house to a human that makes it more accessible and more cost effective for brands to serve that up as well, actually, to give some connection emotionally with those brands. So yeah, definitely a wider reach at both ends actually, and anything in between.
So interestingly, a very powerful hypothesis to test, because it might overall accelerate the overall adoption of self-serve.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. A niche one, James, for you.
Yeah.
There's been some work done around things like debt collection, counselling. Well, some people find it actually too embarrassing to do human to human. They don't like that.
Yep.
And a lot of people, for example, recently have found themselves for the very first time in their life in debt when the pandemic and all of that, and that's just a very difficult, socially embarrassing situation for them. We've tried bots, that has had some success. Do we think that the avatar version of that might even accelerate adoption or even do a better job than before?
I think it absolutely makes sense for this to be the next evolution for that. And you're right in terms of we have seen bots being able to take some of those conversations because they're free of judgment. But it is still a very cold interaction. It's text-based. There's no kind of empathy being presented back to the customer. And with a character, you kind of solve that. So you're providing something which can display empathy. It can have a reassuring voice. It's an opportunity for the customer to vent their frustrations and have it acknowledged effectively. And that can be half the problem in some cases. And I think it then builds that level of trust. And we talked about why avatars can be engaging and why they build trust that way.
Yeah, because I remember actually seeing some use cases run by psychologists, I think, and professional healthcare people, finding opportunity for people who wanted to talk about issues and whatever we want like that, doing a great job already with bots, and this seems to be probably on those kind of people's development path. It would be a great thing to experiment with.
Definitely, I would say so, yeah.
Okay, so that's another one. That's interesting for some folk. Aaron, back to you. Vulnerability, big topic these days. Lots of people talking about it. It's a growing segment. The Contact Centre Managers Association reckons that probably is about 60% of an average customer base that could be defined as vulnerable. The financial stuff, mental health, well-being, all of that. Do you think avatars have got anything relevant to that conversation? Because we're all scrambling at the moment to try and get a strategy to work.
Absolutely. I think everybody's scrambling. I think currently their strategy is rely on people in terms of that notion. And as we know, with anybody hiring at the moment, or the challenges out there and the Great Resignation and that shift, I think they're investing in people, making sure people are well trained. However, there's potentially a scenario brewing, I suppose, in the winter where people are going to experience things for the first time. With the energy price cap, the second phase of that, potentially interest rates moving up. That movement into vulnerability, when people have never been in that situation before in their life, potentially entire new demographics dragged into that space. There's a potential that the volume of vulnerable customers and the people needing and wanting reassurance in conversations is going to be far greater than any workforce can deal with without its intervention. I think in terms of vulnerability, it becomes a brilliant way of connecting an emotional relationship with the customer, wants reassurance or has got questions or answers. And even if it's purely, that can resolve an issue in the whole and give that reassurance, but again, giving a way in that gives a triage point in. To be able to gather information in an emotive way, establish a relationship, and then move that to a human.
Yes.
Could be a great thing to do. I think
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that takes the first part of that journey, understanding needs and priorities.
Yeah. And so it's emotive and
people.
Connected from the onset, not a cold heart traditional bot, and then we end up at a human. People have reason to invest in and maintain in that conversation. I think I'm not an economist. Although I was a long time ago at university, but that's a long way in the past. But those predictions I can't make. But certainly, if you see what's happening, if you believe what's happening, a lack of being able to get the resource, as much as you can invest in the training and the connection, in terms of human empathy and being able to deal with a situation of vulnerability, which is hugely important. We value here, at Capita, is being able to display that and move that to a digital space, this digital empathy at scale.
Yeah,
I think it's certainly valuable. It's certainly, something to think about getting ready for, maybe for the winter that might be coming. And of course, the competition for that resource at that time of the year, we're going to have the energy price gap problem. We're going to have retailers that increase shift to online. There's still that big surge that there's going to be demand for human resource from lots of dimensions all at the same time in environments where I think there's already more vacancies than there are people to fill them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So definitely an interesting bridge.
So just to push the envelope slightly on that one, we've got the visual clues, which I think is important in terms of vulnerability. Some techniques around the actual construct of the conversation. I heard somebody talking recently, which I thought was interesting, to recognise with older folk that speaking more slowly actually works for the cognitive processing powers that we have when we get a little older, and also being willing to explain things more than once, which is an interesting idea. You know, it goes against the average handle time and all the rest of it, but we recognise the customer, we've started to recognise it might be necessary to say it more often than not. A number of us that have still got long COVID might require a little bit more, get the idea, etc., etc. Is it possible, therefore, to calibrate the way that the conversation is constructed in those ways?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, yes. Why? As we are processing, you know, for example, for the AI, you are processing the incoming sentences, right? You can actually detect repetition, you know, and repetition could actually put you so this is the same question asked again in a different form. We can actually identify that, right? And if I see that, that means that the first reaction was not clear enough for you. So I have to find, you know, like a second path, right? And we can actually go into circles until, you know, you stop asking the same questions, right? Because it's a strong indicator that your needs have not been met, right? Mm-hmm. If you're asking those again. So that's number one, right? But one level, I'd like to go back to your point on that. When people actually use the keyboard and the screen, they're entering information, right? That's how you actually talk with like Facebook and other social media, right? And I do believe trust is a big issue there, you know, because we are used to the idea that if I type in something, or communicate with that particular interface, you know, it's going to end up, you know, in the wild. I don't know what's going to happen to it. I have no control over it. So this level of trust, especially in the vulnerable, you know, situation, I think is going to be important. So when you're talking to someone, you know that trust hasn't been breached yet. So I think this is another very important thing, you know, for us to consider, that when you're actually talking to an avatar, talking to an AI, you still have this assumed trust that what you are saying is confidential, and you know it can stay private. And those who actually question that, I think it's going to be very important for the AIs to kind of reassure that, because people do open up when they know that you know it's between the two of us. I mean, I can help you, or I'm going to ask you, like, do you mind if I accelerate? You know, like just push this out, you know, because I need more. So there are certain pieces of technology already in place where we can absolutely, you know, address, you know, the issues around, you know, vulnerability and building a confidence and providing a listening ear, you know, to break down those barriers, or repeat, or for example, pick up, you know, this is how long the sentence was. It took you this long to say it. So I know that, you know, you were talking a bit slower, so I can actually process that differently, right? Or it's the same thing. It's like in 2 seconds, you're able to say all of that. I know which category, you know, I should be, or how I should be tuning my responses. So yes, the technology is there for us to start fine-tuning our responses, which is, I think, imperative for success.
Which is actually the working definition of empathy, isn't it?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly. Well, but the ability for that to scale infinitely without the pressure you may experience dealing in human environments, who've got a hugely important role still to play, but to scale that infinitely without the pressures of traditional handling time metrics, or there's a queue on the people waiting to get through, is actually huge. I think, as you said, you know, speaking more slowly, repeating things multiple times to make sure everybody's reassured and does understand, not because it's getting the wrong answer, just because somebody needs to hear it more than once, and hear it reassuringly more than once is something that's really exciting, I think, because in terms of that truly personalised without any of the traditional boundaries we might have, because the price points, because what you talked about earlier in terms of the computing power, is fundamentally different to dealing with that, you know, human interaction.
This is actually really significant into the next cycle of economics that we're going into, which is basically it's going to be tougher for everyone. That means we're going to be spending less. That means that many organisations are going to have lower projections and growth for the future. What's going to happen? And I do remember very clearly when it happened the last cycle of 2009, I think it was, you know, we had the crash. I was very surprised that most companies did not walk away, in fact, from customers. They doubled down in terms of connecting. And to me, that was one of the start points of this current generation of customer experience. And it's very important, it strikes to me, that even if they're not going to be buying from you, which is still a big motivator for most brands, that you're developing relationship. And what we've just explored is a very cost-effective way of building relationship, yes, and staying engaged at an affordable cost. And I'm sure that is going to become increasingly popular with people as they go, how am I going to afford this?
Well, I think, and I think the other way to think about that brand is, we've talked a lot about that being an inbound and a sort of reactive engagement. The ability to use digital meta-humans as a proactive outreach in marketing conversations, to connect conversations and ask questions about products and features and sales is also interesting as well, at a time where it might be tough, but there's definitely not just a service and cost element here, which can, you know, create that relationship. There's a revenue and sales opportunity here in terms of, you know, these being used to establish, you know, empower and turbocharge marketing or visual communications.
So we're saying, actually, let's move on to the broader point here about having a relationship with an avatar, right? Because at the moment, I would suggest that most of it's purely transactional, one-off. You know, how do I find a bot from my point of view as a customer? Well, the answer is you might have triggered it because we've gotten busy, because you've done some weird online behavior which says, I think you're in trouble, so I'll give you the opportunity to talk to me. You know, when a bot turns up in a chat window, something like that. But if I ask the question of, I like that experience, I'd like to return to it, how do I find it right now? And I don't think anyone's thought about that properly yet, of returning to it. So shouldn't we be having bots who go, James, welcome. How have you been since we last talked? Is that going to kind of be weird and creepy that you know me, or is that going to be just the beginnings of what logically should be the next phase of building a relationship with a digital human?
I think it's building that relationship. We're starting to see it, you know, with the likes of Siri, where it's starting to remember your preferences, and when you go to your phone, it now reminds me to set my alarm before I go to bed, that type of thing. And then we're taking it into the web. So, you know, if we go to the website today, we are looking for things ourselves. We're trawling through the different pages, and if we have an account with that particular website or brand, we might log in to complete a transaction. So we might flip that and to have this hyper-personalization where you just go to your account first, then you're greeted with all of the preferences that you've preset and allowed the company to take various bits of information about you, and you can control that. And then you're having a very tailored, hyper-personalized experience online, which again the avatar can then take you through.
Okay. So in the future, we could definitely have a relationship as an individual human customer with a digital avatar who would become a point of reference between me and a brand. That's not a wild idea? Yeah? Right? They could get to know me, right? They could be a place where I've got all my interaction histories. I mean, I think it's one of the things we like about messaging, isn't it? That the interaction history is still there, so I can keep checking out stuff as far as that's concerned. That's a positive. Could it also be a gateway to a relationship with the actual human? You know, because I actually kind of think that in the analogy of digital twinning, right? Why in our contact centers don't we twin a human with its digital equivalent, and they kind of work as a tag team, you know? Why not deploy it like that? And if you think about a typical journey of onboarding, maybe we begin with the triage point. Do you want to do it? Yes, you do. That's great. Tell me a little more about your needs, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's some paperwork. There always is, isn't there, doing stuff. So the digital human does that with the customer. But then it's a bit rude to say, you matter so much to us, we're only going to do that digitally. It's a bit cheap. So a human should turn up at that point saying, thank you. We really do welcome you. There you go. There's that super bit going on there. Now, by the way, the rest of the stuff I'm going to hand back to my digital equivalent, and off we go. So we have language at the moment that talks about escalation, which is an inverted insult, really, to digital humans, saying, you failed. We now need a human to deal with this point. Whereas in the future, maybe we get rid of that thought process and mindset and go, it's actually a tag team between two capabilities. And back to the point you've made, Alan, it scales in the Great Resignation at a cost point that we couldn't do before. Is that crazy, or is that something that we can look at?
I think, and then you start thinking about the ability of that gateway into an organisation to persist.
Yeah.
Always on, in the sense of,
yep.
You may have a Siri on your phone, why wouldn't you have similar capability for a brand? not
Yes.
just for the technology provider that persists, and at the click of a button, you can ask it a question,
Yeah.
and that becomes brand specific, and
Yeah.
maybe a way of that persistence of that relationship and being able to ask it anything will only cement the relationship with the brand and the ability to pass seamlessly at the appropriate points, right?
Yeah.
Given the emotive state you're in,
Yeah.
given the circumstances. And I think what's really important about all this is that data that you talked about that can persist and, with the right permission, as James saying, but that context it brings on multiple levels to just deliver that hyper-personalisation and the right interaction between digital human, real human, and the right handoff points and the machine learning that empowers that.
Yes.
Because the motivation has got to be a customer outcome, not.
And the other bit that's got to be there is memory of that relationship, because I can't think. Can you think of a relationship with a bot you've got and you remember who it's from? I can't at the moment. It's kind of like purely transactional. So there's got to be something that triggers me to remember that and wants me to go back again, which is the other side of what we said. So that could really configure how people engage. And in fact, I can remember somebody who once asked the question of whether or not I could run the whole of my call centre entirely through bots, which I thought was a little bit overambitious at this particular point in the cycle. But potentially, it could look like that, couldn't it? And the other thing we haven't talked about yet is bots for advisors, agents, team leaders, site managers, digital assistants. Let's explore that for a bit. Is that on the agenda with these avatars as well?
I think we're kind of there. We maybe haven't got a character in front of what we're using currently, but we have a digital assistant, which is, or a conversational AI, which is effectively a digital assistant for our advisors, where they can ask questions rather than searching through knowledge base, knowledge articles, trying to find the answer. They can ask the AI to, what is the answer to this customer question, and either the AI can give a straight answer back, or it can automatically take you to the page where the relevant answer is already. So we've kind of built that assistant there already.
That's already out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think increasingly, with again the move, really that seismic shift in the markets at home working, I think the notion of putting a digital character in front of that, making people feel as though they belong to an organisation, and part of that because always on again for advice, for help, and for that challenge. Obviously, again, speaking to supporting people in the contact centre at home is great, but again, another facet, I think it is massive. And of course, to reflect people's different learning needs. I think, again, we, Capita invested in, an AI-based learning company. And therefore, we can see, we had sessions how we integrate this technology with it, because people have got different learning needs and stances, and how we bring them on board and meet their personalised experience in the workplace is really interesting for us.
So part of this new chapter is also about the customization of that avatar to suit the individual customer, yeah? So would it be worth me hypothesizing and experimenting with, does a different accent drive more engagement? Does a different gender choice, ethnicity? I think you mentioned a few of those points before, Alan.
Yeah.
Is that something in practical terms that you can see yourself, starting to talk to clients and saying, look, here are some choice points you've got here. It would definitely be worth finding out if that's going to drive a better response from customers?
Well, absolutely. I think it depending on the outcome you're looking to search, the ability to A/B test and work your way to delivering the best outcome. There are data points that I suppose the more emotive side of us would probably have an opinion about, but the data and the machine learning would certainly, speak larger, speak volumes in terms of if it does or not.
Yes.
It'd be fascinating to know. The ability to A/B test is pretty easy and straightforward.
Yep.
I think in terms of doing that, and there's only one way to find out, really.
Doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting, though, from whether you have the voice of the brand, or going back to what we talked about before, which is giving the customer the option to choose. Would I perform, or would I be more empathetic with someone who spoke like I did with my accent versus someone that I don't relate to?
Well, I was just thinking that, if I'm an 18-year-old customer, and I had a choice of getting an 18-year-old to talk back at me would that be better than having a 65-year-old talk back at me, you know?
It depends on the subject, right?
Well, yes,
Yeah,
that's
if you-
another
if
interesting
you've
point.
got advice and worldly wildliness and
Yes.
in terms of how that looks,
Yeah.
you might do that. Is that all that great?
But the night out, I just don't want the advice from a 65-year-old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Nor-
okay.
Nor do you want advice from a 16-year-old, you know, so when you're looking for something great. So this goes both ways, right?
It
Now,
does,
one
yeah.
of the things which actually we've been playing around, I have to bring in rapport, right? Because the way you actually configure a session, it's extremely easy to just replace, you know,
Okay.
those avatars in the back end and the voices. So you could still be connected to the same brain,
Yeah.
right? But you can actually just changing one number, you know, on a page, and you're talking to a completely different avatar in a different, with a different speech synthesis, right? But essentially delivering the same cognitive message. So this is another power of the configurability, you know, like what we have in place, right? So A/B testing, go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you know, we can go as far as we want.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So there's some hypotheses that we've looked, which are kind of all like little incidents of just trying it out. Let's scale it now to going, this really works, this is great. Let's reinvent stuff. Let's completely redefine how we're going to do it. And you're one of those kind of brands out there that always likes to be on the leading edge of redefining experience. You know, in terms of customer experience, the emphasis is on the experience bit, so it really grabs you. So let me give you a hypothesis. Alan, this is your kind of thing. Cosmetic company, you know, you're very radical, you're very hip, you're really out there, a lot of people buying into it. You're just launching a new product. You want it to be highly impactful in terms of the way that people remember it and engage with it and all the rest of it. You've seen all this stuff, you like it. How are you going to thread that through potentially into what still remains the job of creating awareness, you know, converting that awareness into trying the damn stuff, pipeline, selling, all the rest of the stuff? How does that get woven in to the life cycle in a kind of new, imaginative way?
Well, I think you talk about that brand management. The first thing is maybe you know, a lifelike digital representation of brand ambassadors, in terms of being able to do that they can become they can exist in social channels and become, you know, those advocates for those brand ambassadors in those channels as a digital human, and have personal conversations with people that obviously can't be delivered by you know, millions of times over by, you know, highly paid person. Obviously there's all manner of image rights and other issues to navigate in that, but I'm sure people, you know, if they're paid enough, will be willing to give those things away to support brands or whatever. So I mean, that's the really interesting thing in terms of experience. I think that it allows to have one-to-one relationships and ask those questions to make those brands stick and be there. I think the other ability is to have an infinite amount of conversations. As I said before, I think if you are trying to get the most potentially out of a brand or a campaign or an experience, the ability to do that without a fear of, you know, I suppose a marketeer's nightmare of nobody turning up, but the brilliant understanding that everybody can turn up and have a conversation and that be served in a personalised way, and in an emotive way that it reinforces the brand and the campaign and the messages, will be hugely reassuring. Right? I think for years we've had, as long as I've worked in the industry, the constant challenge between contact centres having to deal with the marketing campaigns that nobody really knows about, or where they're landing, or the advertising when it lands, and what that means.
Yes.
I think the ability to stimulate these interactions and characters anywhere. So we like to think about the web, but why wouldn't it be from your TVs? You know, increasingly now, you know, we've talked about it for a while about conversational advertising. Why wouldn't the QR code that you're seeing in TV adverts, even more so now, usually as a route to a web page? Why wouldn't that be a route to a conversation for a digital avatar that supports a brand and continues the advert on one-on-one? So
because that's kind of come and gone, the QR code thing, hasn't it? Of course, it's terribly easy to activate now. So you could just have that on a bus stop, any public domain, and then suddenly you've got a pop-up conversation that could happen.
In a store, on point of sale.
Yeah.
You know, I think we need to start thinking about, you know, spaces as well as screens and for this, and then you start thinking about the possibilities of it. You know, it effectively makes potentially everything a channel, and everything creating the possibility of an experience or a conversation with a brand, which really starts to, you know, reinvent things, and the possibilities are endless then when you start thinking like that. If you start thinking about it's on the web, it's on the traditional channels. That's great, and we've talked about all the benefits, but when you start expanding where these conversations can be surfaced, that really becomes powerful in terms of communications and relationships with brands that can be anywhere and everywhere.
Yeah. There's a lot of conversation in retail about combining the digital and the physical, all of that good stuff. And we've got the supply chain synchronicity these days, that works. But what about the kind of notion of avatar as concierge? I can still remember going to, some of the great London stores, and you literally have that person outside in the white gloves and all the rest of the stuff, and they'd be saying it's on the 7th floor, all that kind of good stuff. Have we really fully exploited that notion of an avatar being available to you personally as soon as you enter that space, to then take you around, a bit of the geo-tagging, all that kind of clever stuff, and directing you? What's the opportunity sitting there, do you think, James?
I think it's huge, and it's something that we're exploring at the moment, and we talk about it a lot as those phygital experiences.
Yeah.
So there's the physical experience with the digital convenience, but a lot of it is around the consistency of the experience. So with a lot, particularly in retail, we'll be familiar with online experiences, and we want to carry that into a store, for example. And whether that store is a big department store like we're used to today, or whether it's much more of a smaller experiential store where you can have an avatar which you can then talk to. We talk about kiosks, and for me, immediately comes to mind is kind of something ugly which is kind of just stuck out the floor like a cabinet. That doesn't have to be the case anymore. We have two-way mirrors, we have magic mirrors. Anything that has a kind of a shiny surface effectively can be a screen which we can populate the avatar into, and it can follow you around the store, right?
Yeah.
Why not scan a code or an RFID with your phone, take the avatar with you, continue the conversation at your own leisure.
Love it, love it. You got your buds in, you're listening to the conversation going as you're walking around the place.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very good. Got anybody interested in that yet?
We have.
Yeah, that's very cool.
But imagine, we can actually detect, where your phone's at, right?
Yeah.
So this is what you were mentioning. Imagine if we can actually have, we will have access to of course, to the microphones, right? Say you go past a Nike store, for example, right? And you just say, it's like, just do it. And then, they're back. Now I can actually present you with did you see the latest? So the technology is definitely there to actually utilizing in the right combination the sum of the parts, is and versus the whole, right? I think we are getting to an area where technology will enable these massive, brand new experiences, and pervasively, because you don't even recognize it. That's just happened.
Yes.
All you know is that the guy shows up, indeed, in a shiny surface, and it's like, yeah, well, because I know that you bought this one. It's like, by the way, why? Have you seen this one? It's like, I remember, your kids were talking about getting the same thing. So suddenly, everything is coming together, and then they become part of your daily life. Absolutely. And we talked about the personal assistant, right? So one of the jokes I've been making is I would like my personal assistant to talk to your personal assistant.
Yes, indeed.
Right, and then just have a conversation, and it's just like, well, I'm having an issue with my iPhone. It's like, don't worry, I'm gonna grab Siri for you. Mm-hmm. That's what my personal assistant, right? So I think we will be getting to that level as well. Not to mention the digital influencers. It's like I would love to talk to them. But one of the key points is, I think you're right about the customer experience, the customer service, right? Is I pick up the phone with a certain airline, and I would like to actually do a booking, and they say your call is very important to us. An agent will be with you in 2 hours and 28 minutes, and you're like, oh my God, no,
you're kidding me.
No, it's just not going to fly. But scalability, will enable. If there's a digital, customer representative, it's there for you. Not going to waste your time. Not to mention that the clock is ticking. So there's plenty of areas where I do believe the technology, especially the scaling.
So actually, coming back to that point about the contact center experience, if most of us are on smartphones and all of it has to go through some form of triaging, and intent recognition to route, probably the first experience we should have on the phone then is an avatar's face looking at us and saying, what do you want, and engaging with that in the first instance. Is that kind of the new way in which we engage with customer service?
Well, I think it is, absolutely, yeah. I think, and that not being necessarily driven by telephony, traditional telephony channels, it's not an in and it pings, it's I call that first. I press the button and have that conversation first, and then, if it is a human, I think increasing those This conversation will be more complex and more detailed, and AI is expanding at a point it'll be able to solve lots of issues for people.
Yeah.
But if it is a human that needs absolutely that emotional connection, given the subject matter, and it is sensitive or it's the right thing to do, and the AI understands and knows that, the ability then for that contact maybe to be outbound, because we can absolutely guarantee a perfect match between your personality, the people who are going to match you with. It might be the human version of the digital avatar I've connected with, my personal one, but that might be more of an outbound call. So it'll be interesting that it completely misses out, transcends, cuts out that traditional contact centre layer.
Yes.
On my phone I have a conversation,
Yes.
it's resolved or it's not, and if not then somebody rings me back. All those frustrations we have heard about for years in contact centres that I don't think we've quite solved yet. People hate IVRs, they hate that sort of like binary menu triaging, which actually is what's ended up in bots. Moving that all to be conversationally with zero wait times.
Yeah.
You might have to wait for someone to ring you back, but it's not consuming 2 hours of your time waiting on a hold. We all put it on hold, don't we? Walk around, do our domestic duties or whatever we're doing that day while somebody picks up, then we usually miss it and then cut off by mistake because we jump on the phone. Right, all that customer effort can be removed.
Yes.
And actually, contact centres and customer contact could be reimagined.
Well, I'll lay one down on the table and say websites are a victim of their own success, because actually it's a navigational nightmare these days. Essentially, it's a bunch of pages trying to be logically strung together in terms of navigation. Why don't you just put an avatar in front of it and say, what do you want? I'll go get it you. I mean,
That's that traditional curator or shopkeeper.
yeah.
Either bring the information or bring the items or the goods that you're interested in,
Yes.
or enough about you and your preferences, your choice, your size if it's closed, to be able to bring you the items to the front of the store.
So this is bigger experimentation now, because you're fundamentally changing the nature of the game. But this is exciting for some people who've got the appetite. So doctor experience, healthcare experience could suddenly just be that face engaging with expertise and next actions. A library could be curated in that way, if you think about it, yeah? A call centre could be curated in that particular way. Any service could begin with the simplest of interactions with an avatar.
It's that front of house experience, right?
It is.
It's that person that greets you with a smile and sets the tone for the rest of the conversation that you're going to have.
Yeah. So that could fundamentally reinvent so many markets, couldn't it, and sectors, if we think kind of creatively on that. So last place to go to in this is to say that at the moment avatars are looking for a home, you know what I mean? They sit in a call centre, they sit wherever like that, and they sit on a screen. But you could argue that a natural place for a digital human is in a digital environment, and then we've got the metaverse turning up, which is 4/5 hot air, a fifth turning up real. Indeed, you could argue that when you listen to everything being said these days about metaverse, returning to the conversation we had about Minecraft and Roblox and all of that, in fact, there's nothing new under the sun. It's been going on for quite a long time in many respects. And slightly cheeky, you could say, is the metaverse just sort of Roblox for adults? You can almost say there's nothing new. We've got digital currency. We've got the ability to buy artifacts which are purely digital and use them in this new kind of world. So we've got a lot of hype, but we've also got stuff that is out there. I mean, it's impressive to me that Sotheby's is already out there making money doing it. There are people building whole new environments and selling virtual turf for ridiculous, extraordinary prices, in anticipation of the next Californian gold rush and all of that. And I guess in that new world, we're going to have humans dressed as however they choose to be, and then what we've discussed today, the avatars, and we're going to have that commingling in those new worlds. So I'd just like to sort of briefly explore two things. One, some people say it's here now. Some people say, no, it's over the horizon. Yes. What your views are on that. And then what's the sort of the roadmap that we see being likely for organisations to go, let's dip my toe into this new world and see it? I mean, are we eventually going to see the contact centre going 3D in that way? Let's get into that in a while. So how much, James, do you see is the balance between it's here now versus it's a good story but it ain't here yet?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and from the debates that we've had internally and from the conversation we've had with other people as well, you're either on one side of the fence, one is, yes, it is here now and there's loads of opportunity, or you're on the side where this is a passing trend and it's going to die like 3D TV, right?
Right.
I've been uncomfortably on the fence for quite a while, but I think I've fallen into the former now. And I think if you peel back beyond the technology, what really is the metaverse it's a social construct. It's a place where you go to have a social interaction of some form, just in a virtual or digital or mixed reality. And that, like you say, is not a new concept. We've been doing this online in games for decades.
Yes.
And whether we do it as ourselves or whether we take on the persona or fantasy of a character and the environment of that game, it's really the same thing. I think the metaverse brings us now is some more traditional social constructs just represented virtually. So it's really a broadening of the application, and it's really the realisation of the commercialisation, which is kind of pushing the momentum now, I think.
And although folk would love it to have a single universe, and I happen to be the person that controls all of that, do you think there are going to be multiple metaverses, or just some dominant ones in which everybody eventually finds their peace within that?
I think we'll have a lot to begin with. I think it will whittle down, but it'll come down to interoperability. I think there'll be that call for you to be able to go from one environment to another, and that will be determined by who the big players are. And we see it already, like in the cloud environments, the big players are Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, right? There are some smaller ones, but it's dominated by those kind of three players, and we might see something similar.
Okay.
I mean, there are some interesting business models developing in that space, which means it could accelerate more quickly. There's definitely incentives for retailers over maybe financially over traditional platforms like Amazon that may be affording the metaverse some of the way that they're looking to transact, that if the critical mass can be gained, could be really disruptive, and there'd be some worried larger players out there in terms of what just their business models, I suspect, in terms of being able to create, personalised environments potentially, or personalised shopping malls with only stores you're interested in.
That's interesting. Yeah, I buy that.
Or actually being able to enter into the front door from, with an intent, I want to buy X, and the mall is populated with the vendors who sell those goods. So with a very different model potentially, fully immersive retail experiences. I think it would come down to critical mass though. Because I think it would come down to customer effort. That if I've got to have multiple logins for different environments, and I've got to visit multiple malls and multiple stores and multiple environments, it'll just get to the same way as we get with apps. I think there's some type of element of too many, the effort's too great, the interoperability is not there, and actually it could be destroyed by somebody seeking to be dominant, because it just means it makes it too hard for everybody to play in that space. From a consumer point of view.
Where we are right now with customer service, what do you think, how could you sell a roadmap to that future then, in terms of additional value? I mean, I'm convinced from our discussions today that there's a very clear case from moving from a two-dimensional, probably decision tree-based capability to the one that we've discussed today. I mean, I think that makes absolutely good sense, multiple wins and benefits. Does it help then putting that into this bigger context of a metaverse? Is there any particular reason for that, or is the customer service world not necessarily going to be a leader on this?
I think, again, if it is with a critical mass, and I think it can be a leader. I think it may be interesting that it may be led more from a consumer-led proposition than a brand-led proposition. Again, you can see the attractiveness to a consumer to be able to say, well, I want to have an interaction going on digital humans and then speak to a real human if I'm interested in buying a mortgage. And by the way, here's all the major banks lined up in my virtual that I can pop in and have a chat with and investigate and speak to a real human, connect with video and do that stuff. It could be. So I think.
So maybe it's worked the other way around. Actually, maybe the brand decides for whatever reason it's going to get into this representation, and therefore servicing people in that context makes sense. Therefore, that's how we end up with customer service.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think people won't necessarily put their hands up to say, but I think as brands step into it, and I think gamification, those type of things that bring with us the affinity. People experimenting out with AR and VR type gamification in their brands, whether it's in their merchandise and the like. Well, people do that. There's always things you can scan now on cereal boxes and
Yeah.
everything. That'll only go further.
So who's likely to break out first? Are we looking at travel? Let's take them, for
Yeah.
example. You know, being able to imagine my summer holiday and get 3D on the whole thing. Would that add terrific value and be worth building that as a universe? Or is it going to be retail and those hip brands that always want to get out there first? And are they going to create the critical mass? Well, who's going to be a pundit on this one?
Certainly from what we've seen to date, we took a tour around a virtual mall just last week where there were some big brands already taking part in that. So we think retail is probably lends itself more to kind of starting out and being the pioneers in this space. And then just going back onto the previous point around kind of customer service, and I think you were right, it would be kind of the brands dictating the type of service they want to provide to customers in the metaverse. And we're hoping that some of the brands that we look after would say, well, we're in the metaverse and we want to be able to provide the same service that UCapita provide for us today. So we're starting to look at how we plug some of our stuff into the metaverse and be able to offer, the brand A experience that we provide. Whereas if you go to another store where perhaps we don't look after that brand, you might get a very different service.
Yeah, that makes good sense. That makes good sense. And then the bit we talked about, actually developing persistent relationships with avatars, I'm sure will be another driver, won't it? To being, so where else would I find you? The answer would be, I would find you potentially in a metaverse context.
Yeah.
Yeah, and therefore that would drive through. Attila, is there anything more broadly from the work that you're doing that is giving you insight into the way that the metaverse is unfolding?
Yes. So
he says cryptically.
No, yeah, because it goes. What is the metaverse, generally speaking, right?
That's a great question.
And I've heard so many different definitions for that, but I always go back to the very basics. What drives the need for the metaverse, right?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the kids, and they already have their little metaverses. Starbucks for them is a metaverse. The mall for them is a metaverse. They meet in these tea places. That's their metaverse. That's where they go together. That's where they go, right? And what I see, what I believe is you're not going to go to the metaverse. The metaverse will come to you. I have my own space, and I can actually bring the metaverse. So I can actually feel, a friend of mine comes in my own verse, whatever we're going to call that, personal metaverse, whatever, and it's going to pop out something like, I've been to the latest this and this store, right? Would you interested? Well, yeah, all right. And then we are in that metaverse, right? So we actually had a prototype at a 3D gaming company about bringing online games into the same table. So for example, you're able to see a game going down and it's like, do you like that? Yeah, let's go. And you jump into it, right? So it's all about these portals, and having the ability to bring pieces of the metaverse with you into your own metaverse.
Well, that is an interesting point. So given the point we made about gaming and gamers and being a familiar way of spending my time, is that a potential gateway into the metaverse, therefore? It's not a crazy idea, is it?
But I think we know how to do that. The rest is nobody's sure. We are still experimenting. It's like we're trying to force people to go and into these shared environments,
Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm not interested in that shared environment where I don't know anybody. I want to go to the shared environment with whom I know, or I can actually bring a piece of me and my connections into that particular metaverse, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is where, generally speaking, it's going to take off. But you're right, there's going to be a lot of experimentations around that, how to do that right. And the technology's just started to get to a point where interoperability, we can start, we finally have a unified 3D, description, right? Now we're trying to go after how do you describe the 3D space, the interactions within those 3D spaces, right? So yeah, and big companies have their own ideas, and there are those, who are frankly, it's like a Don Quixote thing, everybody wants to rally the teams to come up with a general solution. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the first is going to be like, fine, you give me an API and I'll bring your store in that particular mall into my space, right? And then I jump into that, and I may choose to come back to my safe space, because safe space is very important, right? Or I actually enter through that store, I enter to that universe, right?
Yep.
So it's I think we live in a fascinating age.
I think that both are true. So I think you're right in terms of there is that idea of or desire to rent out the entire mall and go for a shopping spree with just your family members from around the world, and you're all there together, but it's just you. But I also think there is that other social element where you want to go where the buzz is, where the atmosphere is,
Yes.
where other people are, and potentially meet other people, right? My kids, against my better wishes, are on Roblox, meeting other people, talking to people.
Sure.
And obviously I'm to moderate that as much as possible, but it's happening, and they enjoy the back and forth and the conversation that's taking place from meeting effectively strangers.
Yeah, and the only thing that's yet to happen in that universe is recognisable high street brand names turning up in that context, isn't it? Yeah, which will be a logical extension for those folk, because again, I think the critical point you've made here is critical mass is it. If nobody else is turning up, I ain't turning up. So how do you kickstart that? In some respects, and the gaming community's already got critical mass, hasn't it? It just hasn't sort of gone that extra mile at the end of the day. I think the other thing to say is, although we've concentrated on avatars as a piece of the puzzle within the metaverse, it's also got this other stuff in there. It's got things like crypto, it's got things like blockchain, it's got things like, buying virtual art and everything, digital identity, sovereignty. There's a whole bunch of big concepts which make you go, Web 2, Web 3, difference between, hope we don't inherit the sins of the past and all that other side of the discussion. So we are also discussing something which people are hoping to be a step change in how we do things, as much as it just being another visual representation. So on that slightly broader topic, is there anything you're seeing with customers at the moment that is linking into, blockchain, digital identity, let's say avatars, being able to protect my data online in a fundamentally new way? Is that still too early to talk about yet, or are there signs of people thinking in more radical models?
I think people are still trying to get their head around blockchain. Whenever you ask someone, what do you mean by blockchain, the response that comes back is, well, it's a distributed ledger. I was like, okay, and what's that?
Thank you. Yeah, that told me a lot.
Exactly, yeah. So I think people are still trying to find
Right.
or agree on practical application for the technology. And ID is one of the places where I think it definitely lends itself to, but no one is, well, certainly not from the conversations we had, have gone down that road yet.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. What is the purpose? Why distributed ledger? What is ledger? Great, it guarantees originality, right? And I think it's going to be very important, because in this place, we are already seeing the digital clones, right? I think it's going to be imperative to have a technology that guarantees that I am
who I state I am.
Indeed.
Yes.
And that's where I
Indeed.
see actually the future of blockchain.
I agree.
Right?
I agree. I mean, if we go into the world, let's circle back to contact centers and fraud, and let's talk about the use of synthetic voice right now as a way to appear to be something that you're not for social engineering purposes at scale. We already know that people can be imitated online, and all of that stuff, and the invidiousness that goes with all of that. We're going to a world, particularly of these digital humans, where telling the difference between the real McCoy and a very close approximation is going to become increasingly difficult, isn't it? So one of the points I think, as you've said, about blockchain is it provides us with another anchor into establishing who the heck that person really is or is not. And also, coming back to the point we raised earlier, it may be a place in which my personal data, privacy and identity is also wrapped up. And I think that's what people are talking about, sovereign identity management, is getting around the problems that the previous generation have created for us, which is we don't feel we control that data. We don't feel that we're in charge of that. We hate to think what happens overnight when we put our phone down, how much that's been harvested at scale. And there's a lot of people out there that think, certainly at legislation level, things need to change. So metaverse is not simply a physical environment, it's also potentially a step change, isn't it, in some of those other things. But to your point, it's a little early for many of the people we're talking to have got their heads around of some of that stuff. Yeah, okay, well that's interesting. Great, so we've covered lots. We've talked about avatars from the perspective of what they look and they feel like, and we've given an indication that actually they can look however you want, really, quite frankly. They can look fairly traditional as an animation. They can look hyper-realistic, Or if you really insist on it, they can look like a twerking cow if you really want to, that kind of approach to life.
Yeah.
Whatever you fancy, right?
Or a talking shark.
Or a talking shark.
Right.
Yes, anything you like.
Recently we know.
So that's tremendous from the imagination of how you can re-represent brands. And back to our personalization conversation, you can now genuinely offer choice to people. Comes to our second point, which is then engagement, and how the realism that technology offers us is able to create much deeper engagement. And then that leads back to a primary point. We should see much more self-service coming out of this as a result, because suddenly we're much closer to what a human can offer to another human being. And as far as just a contact, actually any point of engagement is concerned, we have got a highly scalable and a highly cost-effective way of getting things to happen, which we could only have facilitated through a human contact to this point. So this new chapter is about reinventing the way in which we can create engagement in ways that previously were just not possible.
I think one thing probably which we didn't cover, Martin, was that the opportunity to use traditional contact centre conversations as training data.
That's interesting.
Because it mirrors identical the conversation with a human. Using chatbot or web chat type conversations as training data for conversations is a different beast, right? We speak differently.
Yes.
We communicate differently. Actually, the conversations that we're having, we've all got millions of stored in call recordings somewhere, is perfect training data potential for these conversational digital humans.
That's really
it's ready
interesting.
made.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the next step is using those to train the next generation of AIs
Yep.
who already talk with AIs.
Yep.
And generally speaking, the state of the art on that, it would be worth talking about. Have I got to have hundreds of thousands of hours before I've got anything remotely resembling a decent conversation? Or is that becoming slightly more compressed these days and more efficient hours?
It is becoming more compressed. We could get good semblance out of 10,000 conversations usually.
Really?
In terms of what's, it depends on the diversity of the service and what's happening, but there's enough diversity in language and conversation to allow us to understand intent and what's happening there. So, you know, the people are sat on rafts of training data that could turbocharge, you know, the sophistication of digital humans.
Yep. Yeah. So we then looked at lots of individual little use cases, you know, testing, is it better than the previous generation? Everything from beating out an FAQ experience through to potentially having a difficult conversation about a difficult topic. You know, are we going to have more engagement? Are we going to grow the base of people doing self-serve because it's actually a more intuitive way of doing it? And then we explored some bigger ideas, you know, which is how do you reinvent the physical and the digital on the high street, you know? How do you reinvent, for example, taking a new line of product to market, and where would that avatar turn up? We explored the notion that it shouldn't be just transactional and one-off, it could become persistent, how you could develop that. And then we sort of parked that conversation into saying, where might it sit in the future? It could certainly sit anywhere you want. I think that's the point you were making, Alan. It could just be triggered from anything which triggers that conversation. And that's an exciting idea, isn't it? You know, you could therefore populate anybody's world with opportunities to engage with that avatar.
Yeah, more conversations with brands, not less. Is an interesting output of it.
Yeah, at an affordable, scalable kind of a way.
Absolutely.
And then we had a brief look at the metaverse as being possibly another place in which that's turning up. And I think our conclusion on that is that it's interesting, keep watching on that. Some people are going quite hard on it, and clearly it's going to turn up, most likely in retail.
I think so,
Yeah, to begin with. Possibly entertainment as well. I'd put that in there as well as another space that's likely to be taking place. And indeed, back to the first point we made, nothing's really new. It's a reinvention in many respects of an experience a lot of people have had, which is virtual worlds. It used to be called gaming. Yeah, sort of full circle as far as that's concerned. So on that basis, thank you all very much for a very entertaining conversation. We've explored lots of stuff. Thank you for expertise and points of view. I hope the people who've been listening to this have enjoyed it and got something from it. So with that said, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.